Honourable Member for Saskatoon West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier this year, I asked the government to follow through on its promise of housing rights being human rights. Instead, the government has shown time and time again that it does not embrace a rights-based approach. This was clearly demonstrated when the National Housing Strategy underwhelmed us with its half measures to addressing the crisis of homelessness in Canada. In 2016, my colleague from North Island, Powell River, presented this legislature with a bill that would have enshrined the right to housing in our Bill of Rights. The right of an individual to proper housing at a reasonable cost and free of unreasonable barriers. This is what we ask for Canadians, and this is what the government has refused to promise its citizens. How can the government promote its plan for a human rights-based approach to housing without declaring housing to be a human right? The National Housing Strategy discussion paper states there is no universal definition of what a human rights-based approach to housing means. Mr. Speaker, this is government speak for not wanting to do the hard work to build a consensus around a definition in Canadian human rights law. Consultation is only the first step. A government that came to power with the mantra of hope and hard work should not be shying away from that hard work, but instead leading the way. Every year, there are 235,000 people experiencing some form of homelessness in Canada, and almost 3 million Canadians spend more than 30% of their income on housing. In the face of these shocking numbers, the stated goal of the government to reduce chronic users of shelters by 50% is extremely disappointing and hardly the goal of a government that has any intention of enshrining a human rights approach. In fact, many provinces and municipalities have more ambitious goals, and so this goal for the National Housing Strategy is underwhelming and will leave far too many Canadians homeless. Last month, Canada underwent its third cycle of universal periodic review at the UN Human Rights Council, and member countries expressed concerns that a nation such as Canada, one with such an advanced level of development, has rates of poverty and homelessness that are far above expected totals. One peer reviewer from Portugal recommended that the legislation implementing the National Housing Strategy fully recognize the right to housing and provide for effective remedies for violations of that right. The government has until September to decide which recommendations it will accept and which it will reject. The world is watching and waiting to see how Canada will respond to these recommendations. The recent report by the Advisory Committee on Homelessness convened by the government also recommends a more ambitious goal for ending homelessness. The UN Special Rapporteur on the right to housing is also disappointed by the government's low targets pertaining to ending homelessness, as am I. It shows a lack of ambition and a lack of urgency when you only aim to reduce homelessness by 50% over 10 years. We can and must do better. The 2008 budget stated housing in shelters doesn't just provide a safe place to sleep, it saves lives, and this is true. But if we couple this statement with the National Housing Strategy goal of 50% reduction in chronic shelter users, we see a government emphasizing sheltering those who are homeless, not on permanent housing, and not on stepping away from prevention and addressing root causes. A truly rights-based approach policy would focus on ending homelessness, not managing it, not dealing with some people who are homeless, but all Canadians who are homeless. Canadians deserve the right to security, affordability, good health, and safety in the form of adequate housing. Mr. Speaker, will the government reconsider their opposition to enshrining the right to housing in legislation?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Social Development.
Well, thanks very much, and I want to thank the member opposite for her sustained focus on housing and on tackling homelessness. It's a shared set of values in terms of the goals that we're pursuing as a government. I just want to correct the record, though. When we released the National Housing Strategy, the UN Rapporteur on Housing had the following statement that she issued to the world. This is an important step that is in keeping with Canada's commitment to the right to housing contained in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the commitment Canada made in 1975 when it ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. The rapporteur went on to say that she was glad to see that the government has now made a significant shift in this approach and is finally moving toward a more inclusive understanding of human rights, recognizing all people as rights holders, including those who live in inadequate housing and those who are homeless. The National Housing Strategy and our rights-based approach to housing stands distinct from the NDP position in two very important ways. The NDP position, which is simply to have a right to housing, doesn't necessarily provide a way to deliver the housing that's right for a person. And so declaring it a right will get you perhaps into a courthouse, but it won't get you into a home. It may introduce you to a lawyer, but you need a landlord. And while it creates a sort of a hope that you can prosecute your way into housing, the reality is that the UN Convention talks about having a system of housing that people have a right to access. And what we have to do is two things: create that rights-based approach and create that system. The National Housing Strategy is a $40 billion investment over the next 10 years that addresses the full continuum of housing needs. The member opposite says we're not being ambitious enough in reducing chronic homelessness by only setting a target of a minimum of 50%. And she's correct. Other jurisdictions, Victoria, for example, with our $30 million investment paired with the city's investment and the province's investment, will end homelessness within 2 years and be at effective zero. We think there's much progress to be made, but we also know and understand that hidden homelessness is not documented properly in this country. Better data is needed. And so while we step in with a robust $40 billion program, and we house hundreds of thousands of Canadians across this country, lifting many, many out of poverty in the process, the reality is new people will stream into the system, and we have to account for that in the way we make projections. And we are doing that. But I want to contrast our $40 billion investment, which is being spent this year, right now. I was in British Columbia just a weekend ago, in Nanaimo, opening a housing project. We're opening them in Victoria. We're opening them in Vancouver. We're opening them in Toronto. We're opening them in Nova Scotia. It's an extraordinary renaissance that's happening across the country as a result of the National Housing Strategy, and it comes as we start spending close to $4 billion a year on housing, and do that over the next 10 years and increase the funding as we grow the system. But I want to tell you what the NDP's position on homelessness was as we walked into the last election, because this is not a new crisis, and nobody in this file thinks it just suddenly started the last year or two. This is a 10-year program, a 20-year catastrophe that's been in the making. But the NDP, in their approach, was only going to spend $10 million a year to solve homelessness. We're spending $200 million a year on the program that they were only going to spend $10 million on. That's an inadequate response by any measure. And when it comes to new affordable housing construction, for the last 3 years of the mandate, based on their campaign platform, they were going to spend 0, 0, and 0. And I'd like to ask the member opposite, in response, how you solve the housing crisis by not spending money and underinvesting in the sector, because that was their platform. That's what they proposed. No housing system in which to achieve your rights as a human in this Canadian system.
The honourable member for Saskatoon West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't feel that it's for Canadians or the opposition to pat the government on the back for what I feel are half measures when it comes to addressing the crisis of homelessness. A government that is committed to a rights-based approach would not have a goal of 50% reduction in chronic shelter users. It is my job to ask the government to match the action and investment with the urgency of the problem, which I don't feel they have done. The current goal of the National Housing Strategy falls well short and doesn't match the crisis we are facing. All Canadians have a right to housing, not just a temporary shelter. A home should not be a reward, but a fundamental human right. A right to housing is fundamental to the true realization of other human rights, like the security of a person. Canadians have a right to housing, and I'd like our laws to express that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
I restate this. The party opposite ran on a platform that promised to spend $10 million extra a year on homelessness because they thought the crisis was extraordinary. We spend $100 million above and beyond what was being spent. In other words, we're spending $200 million a year, which is 20 times more than the other party, and the other party says we're being timid and inadequate. The only thing worse than us not achieving much more success on this is if the party opposite had been elected and had kept their promise. And when it comes to the rights to housing, it is pointless to have a right to housing if you're not providing the housing that people need. And the party opposite, well, they talk about the right to housing. They have the opportunity now to support a rights-based approach, and they talk about it being a crisis, and they have an opportunity to start supporting our budgets that are putting more money into housing than they ever dreamed of putting in a platform, let alone actually investing into real housing. If the party opposite is serious about the housing crisis in this country, they should be commending us for taking the bold action we've taken, supporting the legislation we're putting in front of this House.
Order. 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 Pursuant to order made Tuesday, May 29, 2018, the motion to adjourn the House is now deemed to have been adopted. Accordingly, this House stands adjourned until later this day at 10 a.m. pursuant to Standing Order 24-1.